Welcome, everybody. So this talk is called Almost None to Some, Driving DISQO's Doc Culture as a Solo Documentarian. I'm Falon Darville, and I'm a private investigator turned technical writer. My educational background is that I have a Bachelor of Arts in English with an emphasis in critical theory from UC Davis, and I also attended a coding bootcamp where I earned a certificate in full stack engineering from the UC Davis Extension. So currently, I'm the sole technical writer at a data insights startup called DISQO, and we're headquartered in Glendale, California, which is in the Los Angeles area. Day to day, my job looks like determining what documentation we need, making, moving, and working on tasks for my backlog in Scrum style, leaving flexibility for ad hoc tasks, and holding working sessions with individuals who have key information. So today we're going to go over the 5 core ways that I helped move my company from having almost no documentation to having some documentation. So the first one is find comfort in incompleteness. Second, influence, don't force. Third, empower others through onboarding and training. Fourth, establish key partnerships. And fifth, find your place in the organization as a solo technical writer. So since we're all at home and maybe we're feeling a little bit disconnected, I want to kind of do something that'll make us feel like we're all in the same room. So that's attendee involvement. Of course, this is optional. It's your time. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to offer you a couple ways to get involved in your own home. So that's going to be mottos. So mottos are ideas or slogans that we can memorize, write down, and keep posted in plain sight. And these are just going to help us integrate today's ideas so you can write them down. They'll also be available for you in a blog post on my website, and the URL is at the very bottom of this slide. So you don't have to write them down during the presentation if you don't want to. So the other way that I'm going to encourage attendee involvement is through writing prompts. And these will help you explore these 5 topics a bit more on your own and help to situate them for you within your organization and your context. So let's hop into our first topic for today, which is finding comfort in incompleteness. So the challenge with incompleteness is understanding that it's not necessarily a reflection of the work that you've done. So there are other factors that contribute to incompleteness that are potentially out of your control, like a lack of people resources, a lack of infrastructure in place to promote documentation contribution, a lack of managerial and organizational support for documentation, and a lack of perception or insight into projects and products. So it might be helpful for you to think about the ways in which you potentially are lacking from the perspective of these 4 bullet points. So next, it's important that we shift our mentality from putting all the pressure on ourselves as a solo technical writer or on a small technical writing team to viewing documentation as an organism. So I'm really interested in linguistics, and I kind of made this kind of loose connection between descriptive and prescriptive linguistics and their application to documentation. So for descriptive linguistics, in that context, applied to documentation, we'll inevitably have to revisit documentation. So if we understand the act of description, then logically we can see that it will evolve as the organization and products evolve. We'll also have to accept that descriptive mode of thinking includes acknowledgement of incompleteness. And I wanted to add in as a personal note that as I matured as a writer, I learned that language is highly changeable and quickly evolves, just like documentation. So basically, with descriptive linguistics applied to documentation, I'm just saying that we should view the act of documentation as describing instead of as trying to put limitations on products and projects. With prescriptive linguistics, you're finding yourself putting stops on the ability for documentation to grow in the way that it needs to. Prescription, I suggest, should be reserved for style guides and starter templates, but these inevitably will also require accommodation for deviation from those as the organization grows and as we learn new things and we need to add more information. So next, how do we relieve the pressure off of ourselves when documentation is incomplete and minimal? Well, we have to remind ourselves of the limits of our resources and not conflate those limits with anything that we've necessarily done wrong. So my comparison here is if we're budgeting on our salary, then we have to live within our means. And if we're producing at work, we also have to do that within our means. So the ways that we can relieve that pressure are by giving flexibility, by offering templates, but promoting adapting the docs to case-by-case needs, recognizing that it's very likely you don't have immediate visibility over all content, products, and business knowledge, and accepting that errors like spelling and grammatical errors are going to occur, while at the same time doing your best to eliminate them. So this is the slide I was talking about where we're going to have more engagement. So here I'm going to offer you an unhelpful thought, something that's kind of going to stop you in your tracks. Then I'm going to offer you a motto, and then I'm going to offer you a writing prompt. And again, these are available on my website in case you don't want to write them down right now. So our unhelpful thought is, I work towards perfect documentation. Our motto is, I work towards good enough documentation. And our writing prompt is, what does good enough mean to me? And how can I differentiate good enough from perfect? What are my parameters? All right, so our next core way that I was able to move my organization from almost no documentation to some documentation is by influencing and not forcing. So first thing I had to say is that not all efforts are going to make an impact, and there are probably reasons why. So helping ourselves by identifying those reasons can be very beneficial. So an example on my end is that last year at my organization, I created a request for comments, or RFC, to add documentation to tech debt. So basically this means that I wrote like a short proposal saying that documentation should be considered as tech debt. So efforts like these don't always work at organizations for many factors, but I was able to identify 4. So these 4 are, there's no overt managerial backing. Just because you get a stamp of approval does not mean you have enough to actualize. So the second reason is that documentation may not be perceived as critical or having a direct impact on business performance, or documentation may be seen as an aside from engineering. The fourth reason that I kind of thought of was that organizations are simply not mature enough for lack of documentation to become a liability, or at least not identified as such. So to influence others, you could start by providing immediate value. Make your work visible. So do this by joining stand-ups, demos, and post-mortems. So you can reach out to PMs and ask them to send you a calendar invite. You can talk to some engineers to figure out when they're hosting these and if these are open ceremonies or if they're more closed. You can send completed work to colleagues and prompt them to show you more areas where documentation is lacking. You can get into release channels and announce your deployments just as engineers do. I do this at my organization, and I treat all of my releases just as the engineers treat their code. You can create surveys to enable others to anonymously or not anonymously share their experience with documentation at your organization. And you can blog about your organization's documentation to gain more exposure and also make your work more visible. So I do this at my current company because I also run the developer blog. So I have written some articles about our documentation efforts, and that really helps to solidify me as a technical writer in the organization. So another way that you can influence and not force is lean into others, do-it-yourself mentality. Engineers often have this built-in, that's a characteristic a lot of them have. So you can empower others by giving them information on how to pitch in. Some of your colleagues may be pro docs and want to do it themselves. Give them the tools and access to add their own documentation. Give them a protocol that involves you. And if you use the docs as code approach, like we do at DISQO, have engineers submit merge requests, and then you can review them. You can set up that protocol in which you're able to ensure the quality's there. And also, when we're talking about quality, keep an open attitude about the quality and quantity of content that engineers pitch in, because harsh feedback can promote silence. So it's always better to do the I think it's called the compliment sandwich, where you're ensuring that you're still promoting involvement in documentation, and you are pitching in your part to kind of up that quality. All right, so for influence, not force, or unhelpful thought is, I force people to see how important documentation is. Our motto is, I empower others to take responsibility for documentation. And our writing prompt is, how can I promote documentation visibility and empowerment at my company? And in which ways have I already done this? All right, moving on. So we also can empower others through onboarding and training. We cannot empower others efficiently through our own aimlessness. That's why it's good to start with ideas and then do the work off of those ideas. So as I was designing the architecture for our internal documentation hub, I created 3 tenets that would kind of guide my decisions about like how I would organize the site and what type of content I would have on there. Those tenets are transparency, give engineering team members equal access to concepts, terminology, and API documentation. Improve communication, which means allow all engineering team members to learn and discuss concepts and terms that enable them to improve team communication. And lower barriers to entry, or give engineering team members a centralized place to access data delivered via Slate, Hexo, and Wiki style. This will decrease the ramp-up period for new team members. So basically, I've congealed these ideas that are going to give me my mission moving forward. So onboarding is another way to empower others, and it serves several functions. There are a lot obviously not included, but these were the ones that I was able to clearly identify. So onboarding shows new employees where documentation is and how it's organized. It allows you to gauge the employee's initial level of interest in documentation. It shows you flaws in design, content, organization, and layout as you walk through your own work. And it opens a channel for the employee to provide feedback to you and ask relevant questions that you can later address in your documentation. So training comes in many forms and can include the following: onboarding sessions, one-on-one or in groups. You can and should create technical writing documentation, even if it's just you. So create style guides, create best practices, and create concept guides. Because like I was saying earlier, that aimlessness is not going to let you be a leader for others. And then also with training, you'll want to show others the technical side of what you're doing. So for me, since I'm working with Docs as code, and sometimes I'm working with people who are not as tech savvy, and I still want to enable them to contribute to documentation, I'll provide technical training for Markdown, Git, and Terminal. So the creation of any training material is gonna help you refine your goals and move away from aimlessness. So our unhelpful thought with empowering others through onboarding and training is, I assume new engineers and other roles will gravitate to documentation on their own. our motto is I guide new employees through documentation. And our writing prompt is, what does documentation onboarding look like to me? And what would I want to walk someone through? Okay, the next way that I was able to get our docs from almost none to some is by establishing key partnerships. So when you're solo, or even if you're not, if you're in a small team or large team, you're gonna get more done when you get others on board with what you're doing. The challenge in establishing key partnerships for me was determining who would help me in my goal of increasing the volume and quality of documentation. So start to think about the types and amount of allies you need to help you do your job better. This depends on the size of your organization and the ratio of technical writers to engineers and other engineering department roles. It also depends on what's expected of you. Look over your job description, figure out what types of documentation are most critical for your organization, and figure out your allies from there. So single out individuals who are pro documentation, or at least they show the least amount of resistance toward documentation. These are some characteristics that I've been able to pinpoint in individuals that have made great allies for me. So they're curious about the documentation process. They do their own documenting. They express overt interest in documentation. They're responsive and answer you in detail. And they don't shy away from clarification and asking questions. Next, I recommend finding at least one ally per job title within your organization. And of course, this doesn't apply to every type of seniority role. I would just kind of basically group job titles together. And these were the three that I've identified for my own work that were the most helpful to me. A software engineer who would help me to troubleshoot and debug, a product manager who would help me to understand the organization's client needs, and a manager to help me see the bigger picture needs of the organization. Of course, you're going to be working with tons of different people, but these are specific allies that you will especially form stronger partnerships with. These allies don't all need to be senior level, and I would actually recommend getting people from different levels. And that's because you can really benefit from allyship on all different career levels and paths. So next, one thing I did was I formed a documentation focus group. So we're called the Tech Doc Guild. We meet once a month, and I've actually started to have 2 meetings per month because we have a huge time gap between US workers and workers in Armenia. So we have an office in Armenia. So I'm meeting with both teams. And basically, this is a group of engineers, and I've selected engineers or been recommended engineers from different teams. And I basically check in with them to see what they think about the documentation efforts going on their team. I learn if there's anything coming up for them that I can help them with. And I determine how integrated documentation is in their sprints and in their team communications. So this is my way of gauging the documentation culture, getting a pulse on it. It gives a voice to individual contributors because they're at the root of the code and they're accessing documentation in their day-to-day job function. So it's very important for me to have direct relationships with the people immediately accessing documentation. So for establishing key partnerships, our unhelpful thought is I try to get everyone on board with documentation. And our motto is I invite those interested and curious about documentation to be my allies. And my writing prompt is how do I currently keep myself open to partnerships within my organization? And how can I promote a continued attitude of openness? So our next topic is finding your place in the organization as a solo technical writer. So I kind of mentioned this before, but it's critical that you build your department even if it's just you adhering by your own rules. So develop your technical writing style guide. For inspiration, check out Microsoft, Google, any company that's kind of comparable to yours or that you really aspire to be more like. And you can aim high with this and really start to apply those rules to your own work. Next, develop technical writing onboarding documentation. And I say here, yes, even if you're alone, because developing that onboarding material for your own position is going to help you clarify what you do and is a tangible way for you to show others what you do when they inevitably ask. It's also going to help you identify gaps and things you need or want to address or work on in your department. And another way to build your department is to develop standards for your different types of documentation, such as differentiating between an API documentation and a guide. And then finally, you're going to want to keep a file of questions you're asked and build documentation with answers. And when people ask you those repeat questions, you're just going to direct them to your documentation. You're going to send them a link. Next, so develop your place in the organization by attending and being an active participant in inter and cross-departmental happenings. Just because you work alone doesn't mean you always have to be alone. And even us introverts are sometimes going to want human interaction. So reach out when you need that interaction. So some ideas for staying visible in your organization is maybe start a Slack channel if that's appropriate within your organization's atmosphere on a topic of interest. This could be work or non-work related. You can attend Zoom meetings or events, they're not meetings, like happy hours and holiday celebrations if your organization is doing that right now. You can also start or join a book club. So my company has a product manager book club that I attended until my TBR got too long. As you see, I have a lot of books. So technical writers are also not limited to planning and writing documentation. And as writers, I encourage you to find other outlets within your organization that let you have a break from the technical. And these could be great ways to secure gaps within your workday so that you can engage in alternative modes of thinking. So within my organization, I express an interest in diversity inclusion initiatives, especially with the occurrences of last year in the United States. And now I'm part of an employee resource group. So in this group, I get to do things I'm really interested in and I care deeply about, like researching and writing about topics like social justice and mental health. So that's been a great outlet for me, and it makes me feel like I'm doing something in alignment with my ethics. So it's very cool. So with finding your organization, with finding your place in the organization as a solo technical writer, your unhelpful thought is, I'm a background player. And your motto is, I have a strong identity within my organization. And your writing prompt is, how do I perceive my own identity within my organization? And how do I want my identity within my organization to look? So let's review what we went over today and our mottos. And again, these are going to be available on the website, so you don't have to scramble and write all these right now. So how I got my organization from almost no documentation to some documentation is through these 5 core means, which are finding comfort with incompleteness. And our motto is, I work to have good enough documentation by influencing and not forcing. Our motto is, I empower others to take responsibility for documentation. By empowering others through onboarding and training, our motto is, I guide new employees through documentation. By establishing key partnerships, our motto is, I invite those interested and curious about documentation to be my allies. And by finding your place in the organization as a solo technical writer, Our motto is, I have a strong identity within my organization. And that's it. So again, the name of the talk was Almost None to Some, Driving DISQO's Doc Culture as a Solo Documentarian. And thank you so much for spending this time with me and listening to me talk about my journey as a solo documentarian. And you can find me on LinkedIn and the Write the Doc Slack and my website and my email. Everything is Falon Darville, my full name. So I really appreciate it, and I'm really excited to hear everybody else's talk and learn so much and write a ton this weekend. So thank you.
Hey, Falon, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Thank you for such a great talk. I think we don't have a lot of questions because I think you put so much detail into it, and I think people were just totally engrossed in this whole idea of really building what you built and the different steps of it. I loved how, and there was so much great feedback about the unhelpful thoughts and kind of reframing that and really empowering yourself, which I think in the Slack, we get a lot of talk about how lonely it can feel and how difficult it can feel. So I think that I really liked the human side of your talk. So that was great.
Thank you. Yeah, it's made me definitely feel a lot less like lonely as a technical writer being at Write the Docs, like for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, excellent. We've got some questions coming in, so we can get started. So Jennifer asks, what do you think of seeking allies beyond developers or project managers or managers? Maybe this can be an extension of your writing prompt about keeping an open mind to partnerships.
Yeah, I think it's great just in general to create partnerships in any part of an organization. You never know where you're going to get a new idea or somebody is going to like suggest something to you. So I definitely love even like marketing. I talk with them, even though I don't do that much work with them, I still get a lot of ideas. Oh my gosh, sorry, I have a cat.
So do I, it's all good.
So yes, definitely form allyships across all parts of the company.
That's great. And Jennifer was also wondering more about your tech writing onboarding documentation. So maybe if you could share some details of what you've done or things that you might imagine others would do in different contexts.
Yeah, so with my documentation onboarding, basically I've created two different types of onboarding. So I've created onboarding that's very detailed and is specifically for people that I think are going to be technical writers. And then I've also created documentation that is specifically angled towards people within our engineering organization. So I have created slides, and then I've also created a narrative format that goes through everything we go through in the slides. So this is introducing all the tools that I manage, how to actually contribute documentation, how to navigate our documentation site, and also how to navigate the two other sites that I manage, which are the engineering blog and then also our incident site.
Well, they keep you busy there.
Yeah, it's very thorough, but it also like allows me not to have to retain all of it in my head. I can just send the link out. I can always have the same slides to refer back to. And then once I've also completed the documentation onboarding with these individuals, I'll send them a list of like key links that are going to help them to succeed within the organization, such as a link to our org chart so they can start learning people's names, and a link to everything that we went over in case they forget at any point.
I just think you must be everybody's favorite person. That's so great.
I think that, yeah.
Alex was wondering, with regards to finding other roles within an org, do you think that tech writers would be good scrum masters for an agile dev team they're paired with?
I think that I would say no, I wouldn't advise that, because the PM is a position all on its own. And I think that's quite a bit of work that you would put on yourself. I think it is very important for a technical writer to have a distinctive role and to work in alliance with a product manager, but to run a scrum sprint for an engineering team is quite a lot in itself. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to be realistic about the amount of work that would go into it, because it sounds like you're busy enough as it is. But yeah, maybe it might work for people who are looking for a bigger change of pace, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from, oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry. I just want to add that I do run my own Scrum sprints, but I run it specifically for documentation. And that in itself is also enough work to do, because I'm not only writing docs, but I'm also determining what needs to be written.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, for sure. Scott has a question. He says he really enjoyed your talk. I think we all did. How has your experience as a former private investigator helped understand your colleagues and inform your mottos?
Well, so I think that being a private investigator, like, definitely let me accentuate the curiosity, the natural curiosity that I have. And I think that's a natural thing that people who go towards writing have. I just happen to express it in the form of private investigation. So I think that's something that every writer has, that natural inclination to figure things out and to narrativize things, which is what a lot of times I was doing as a private investigator. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
No, you're good.
I was taking a lot of data and then creating narratives out of it.
And sometimes distractions happen and you still have to keep going. So this is a great example of that.
My wild cats. Bring the cat on camera. She is like,
please do. I live for cats on camera.
She's in her little lion mode right now. So let me see if I can grab her.
I don't want to put your safety at risk. So.
Okay, well, I grabbed the curtain, so hopefully she doesn't keep whacking it around. Cats are in heaven.
Yes. That's so great. Alexander's got a question, which I think is going to be relevant to a lot of people. Suggestions for navigating a large enterprise org that has extremely aggressive software deliverables. So they're saying high dev to tech writer ratio that prioritizes sprint velocity and story points for code releases, and getting docs as code implemented has been a challenge with lots of pushback. I think this keeps a lot of us up at night.
Yeah, that's what I'm experiencing at my current company with, especially with one of our teams. It's basically the money makers. You kind of want to be realistic about how much you're expecting from them, because a lot of times they're like, they're just like cranking out a solid 10 hours of work a day. So in that instance, what I'm doing is I'm kind of letting them kind of have their insular documentation, because that's what they're capable of doing now. And I'm being realistic about that. But I am taking some of their time in that I'm inviting a couple members into the Tech Doc Guild just so that I can have like a bird's eye view of what's going on. So that's a difficult one for sure. And there is no answer really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's sort of, I think that leads well into a question from Tana, who asks, for the key partnerships, do you have tips to sort of entice or welcome those and other roles into the conversation on docs?
I would say that the enticement comes from maybe even prioritizing their work. So you can create that direct line of response and say, I will get this back to you ASAP. So you can kind of bump up their work in an ethical way, of course, and just kind of tell them that you're really prioritizing the work that you're doing with them, and then offer a helping hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
for sure. Andrea has a question where she's identified this sort of work as glue work, which some people might not have heard that term before, but it's kind of like all the extra stuff, like people managing and communication that might not officially fall under your job title as a technical writer or whatever job title that you have. So she's asking if you have any suggestions for maybe offloading that glue work onto other people so that you're not the only one like holding things together, as it were.
Yeah, that's also tricky. That's also like finding your place within the organization. And I think that the way that you offset that glue work, I think that's really interesting, is by making yourself visible. So whether that's like getting into Slack channels, just showing that, hey, I'm here and this is my primary job function, so you can come to me. And I do this by, making announcements in our engineering organization Slack channel to let people know when I've updated specific docs, and just overall being an active participant.
Yeah, that's really great. So we had a couple questions from Maria and Janet about sort of getting started. And so maybe for people who would love to be where you are, so there are questions about starting a documentation initiative in an organization where maybe that doesn't exist yet. So they've come at this from two angles. So where would you get started? And then on the personal level, like how do you establish yourself with a strong identity as a lone technical writer? So it's kind of like who you are and what you do, I think.
Yeah, that is definitely something I've thought a lot about. And oh man, and it's also changed as I've been developing. I don't have a ton of experience in technical writing. I've just really emphasized learning as much as I can and creating a distinctive identity. So basically what I do is I say, hey, this is me, these are my strengths, I'm coming to the organization and I'm gonna play out my strengths in this context. So that's kind of how I've done that. Yeah, I mean, it's an ever evolving process. It's about just getting to know who you are at work and not also tying it to what you think a technical writer should be. For example, I wouldn't have thought a technical writer would be part of an ERG, yet I signed up and I made myself visible in that sphere because that's what I wanted to do.
I really love that answer, and the fact that you said that, yeah, you're not a super experienced tech writer, and you really don't have to be in order to have such a great effect on the docs culture at your organization. I think that gives a lot of people some hope here that you don't have to be this technical wizard or somebody who's been in it for a super long time in order to really be able to pull things together and really have a great effect. So thank you for that. We've got time for one more question, and that comes from Kat. It's a dev blog editing question. How do you balance respecting and maintaining the post author's voice and honoring the style guide and corporate voice? Maybe these things might be in tension sometimes.
I love that question because that's definitely something that I have a lot of experience in with this developer blog. So basically, when I am working on developer blog content, I work in working sessions with the engineers because a lot of our engineers also, English is not their first language. So I want to make them feel very comfortable in the writing process. So basically we'll go through different working sessions where at first we'll brainstorm a topic and then we'll go through and create an outline together. And then I'll kind of throw it to them and say, hey, come back to me with 600 words. These are some parameters for it. Remember that it's a first draft. It's supposed to be bad. If it's not bad enough, then there's an issue. But so what I do is I keep kind of prodding for more information as they provide drafts for me. And then I do the heavy editing later on to enable them to develop their own voice. But I also recognize that developing a writing voice comes with a lot of time. Like, for example, I don't think I really developed my writing voice until I was like 10 years into writing. So it does take a while, and I recognize that sometimes you're going to have to focus more on the content itself as opposed to shining their voice, because they haven't probably developed a voice as a writer, especially if the contributor's main job description is engineer.
Yeah, that's great. And I love that you're saying that it's maybe they don't have one now, but there's always room in the future, right? We're all growing as writers, and that's always happening, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah. And I don't want to put a huge burden on engineers to do a lot of the editing work, because I want them to feel confident in contributing more next time. Yes, so I want to do a lot of the heavy lifting.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Falon. I loved this talk. I know that so many people did so much good stuff in the chat that I hope you saw. So yeah, this is really great. And I think that people are going to be banging down your door for links to your prompts and your mottos. So I think there's a lot of interest in those. So thank you so much again. And just a quick reminder that there are 4 minutes left if you want to submit a lightning talk. The link is in reception. So thank you again, Falon. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.